Hi again, this is Peter Konechny at medievalist.net, and we are at the Canadian Conference of Medieval Art Historians here at the University of Toronto, and we are delighted to have with us Professor Jim Bugslag of the University of Manitoba, who just gave a paper today about pilgrims and their interaction with in churches with the relics there. And as you were speaking, like basically, we go into a church now, and we can see these relics, but we can't touch them, nor could we like interact with them, and it's a very kind of safe environment. But the Middle Ages is different from.
It is indeed. Well, I mean, it's different in two ways. I mean, we have a very sort of idealistic conception of art. I mean, art museums now have signs up, "Do not touch the art," and that's one very large sort of difference between us and the Middle Ages. And in many respects, the miraculous images that I was talking about in medieval churches are akin to relics, and people liked getting as close as they could to these things because they had sacral power. And in days before modern medicine or hospitals or anything like that, thaumaturgical cures were worked through these means, and it was in people's best interests to get as close as possible. Touching, kissing, scraping bits off of statues or images. These were all very, very common practices. Very different, you're right, from what we now think of as religion. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of reforms of the 19th century, which, well, I mean, not just then, but church reform has been trying to erase what they see as superstitious practices for an awful long time.
What was like some of those kind of practices, like you mentioned things about like with children?
Sure, children, information about children survives in large numbers because that seems to be an area where a lot of these medieval practices have survived, particularly out in the countryside. So, for example, I gave the example of Saint Vaast in Picardy, where he would be shown holding a shoe, and mothers would take their children up and touch their children's feet to the shoe in order to help them walk properly and get over things like rickets and things like that. There were a lot of practices that go back, many of them even before Christianity in Europe, and were Christianized and kept surviving because there was really nothing else for these people to do, nowhere else for them to turn.
Were these practices kind of like a local practice, or would you see things that would be very similar, like in France and in England and elsewhere in Europe?
They're remarkably widespread, and some of them I think you have to think of in terms of, like, you know, the Indo-European language group. I showed images of trees in which bits of cloth and garments were draped in Europe in order to effect some kind of miraculous cure. You can find remarkably similar sorts of practices in India, for example. The extent of them has never really, to my knowledge, been systematically investigated. And all of these practices have been relatively ignored, so there's an awful lot of work to do to like make sense of them and just give them some kind of geographical and historical sort of perspective.
Now, I also noticed like there was even kind of a sense that people were almost living in these churches because they could stay and sleep in them. And
they certainly used them an awful lot more familiarly than we do. I mean, it was not just you know, traipsing off piously on Sunday morning and once a week, but people used churches for all sorts of different reasons, and they were the local sources of sacral power, which could cure you, which could really make a tremendous difference in your life, not just in terms of your salvation eventually, but in all sorts of respects for your daily life. If there was a drought and the crops were burning up, you went to the church and processed the local relic or miraculous image. If it was raining too much and the crops were being damaged, I mean, there was other saints that took care of that. There was all sorts of recourse to churches for things we would now consider secular, but once again, without the sort of modern level of medicine or science, they turned to the church.
Well, even if the water was the wells there weren't even have a healing, I guess you can get your water from there every few days. So.
Absolutely, and there's no real sort of, I've seen pictures of healing wells where there are women washing their clothes right next to it. I mean, the sacred and the secular were far more closely meshed in the Middle Ages than they are now.
Oh, so could you just tell us about your other kinds of research you're doing here?
Well, I primarily study medieval stained glass, and I'm a member of the Canadian Committee of the Corpus Vitriarum. We have about 180 pieces of pre-modern stained glass in Canadian collections, all from Europe, from anywhere from the 12th to the 17th centuries. So I'm engaged in trying to research and publish them. I came to this whole pilgrimage thing from an interest in Chartres Cathedral, which is a treasure trove of medieval stained glass. But my interest just spread from the stained glass to the sculpture, to the church, to the practices that took place there. And it's really been not so much a subject as a curriculum for me. A lot of my interests, such as pilgrimage, come directly out of my interest in Chartres Cathedral.
Well, thank you so much. It was a great paper. I think it really was interesting and a lot of eye-opening for everyone.
My pleasure.
Thank you.